We don't need a joke.
We always need a joke. Andrea, how many people have we talked to that said, my favorite part is when you guys joke around in the beginning? At least one.
Yeah, at least one.
This is the moonnco podcast, where we help you take back control of your well-being and regain your mental clarity. Join our growing community for resources, support, and guidance at moonnco.com. This podcast is intended for entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice.
Welcome back to episode 13 of the moonnco podcast.
13. Lucky number 13.
Yeah, we've been on a bit of a hiatus, but we're back at it.
It's been a busy few weeks, though.
Yeah.
So.
With no signs of slowing.
Well, no, we did slow down. That's the problem, right?
Well, yeah. No, I mean, our lives are not slowing down.
No.
But the podcast needs to speed up.
Continue.
So, all right.
Even Franklin's not happy about it. He's grumpy about it.
He's very grumpy. All right. Well, on today's episode, we are going to talk about navigating the medical system, both conventional medicine and alternative medicine. This is an episode we've been talking about doing for a while of just how to approach things, tips and things that we've learned over the years, and why it is so important to really, unfortunately, right, as we talk about all the time, you really need to own your health or your family's health and take responsibility for it. And when you're navigating a complex medical situation like we had different doctors, at least 4 different doctors she was seeing regularly. So you've got appointments, you've got medical bills, right, that you need to coordinate, insurance approvals or denials. If you're working in the conventional medicine realm, even in alternative medicine, right, there's still the responsibility still on you to reach out to those providers to make sure you're following through on the things that you need to do. And prioritizing, right? Because sometimes you're just in mission critical and you're like, this is a nice to have thing that we want to do at some point, but right now we need to, focus on just staying above water. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the struggles we had early on and then things that we learned that helped make it a little more manageable, I guess.
Yeah. No, I'd be happy to. And it's a difficult topic, and the medical system is extremely complicated. And as you said, when you start dealing with a complex medical issue where you have multiple specialists, maybe you have a second opinion, a third opinion, you have teams of doctors, teams of specialists. In some cases, you can be assigned a case manager, and you can ask for that request. It's not always granted to you, and even at that. You still have to really manage it. But some of the specifics that I can point to that may resonate with some people who are listening, or just to kind of give you some insight into what we're referring to when we say complications with the medical system. I can remember one situation where our daughter had to go under general anesthesia, and there were 2 different procedures that needed to be done, and coordinating that with the 2 different surgeons and the 2 different doctors was like an absolute nightmare. Mm-hmm. It took us like 3 weeks to get this appointment scheduled. And it wasn't a super urgent procedure that needed to be done, because she was in a critical state. But they both were things that were going to give us some leads as to how we can get her symptoms to be better. And this was at the time where her anemia wasn't so bad that it was like we were doing blood transfusions every other week, but it was getting to that point, like we were just watching the hemoglobin number drop and drop and drop. So that's one example of, we were dealing with the same hospital, but we were dealing with 2 different specialists within the hospital and trying to figure out how to coordinate it so that she was under anesthesia for the lowest amount of time possible, was really difficult. And then on the flip side of that, aside from scheduling procedures and things with the hospital, is dealing with the insurance. And at one point she was put on a biologic medication, which for those of you who don't know, biologic is essentially a medication that you get via an infusion. Oftentimes, there are other ways that you can get it via just a home injection. But for this specific one, the first, they call it the loading dose, the initial dose needed to be done as an infusion. And then after that, you get what's called maintenance doses, which are ones that you can do as an injection at home. And for whatever reason, the insurance company approved the loading dose, but didn't approve the maintenance doses. So we fell into the situation where she was on this medication and she needed to get her first maintenance dose within a certain period of time. Otherwise, the loading dose the efficacy rate significantly drops if you don't get those first maintenance doses and get her on to a regular routine. I spent, God, I couldn't even tell you, at least 20 hours on the phone with insurance companies trying to work through this issue and trying to help them to understand why she was on this medication, because it wasn't technically FDA approved for her age, and there were all these complications. And I remember that was the first time, for a long time when we were dealing with this, I was very unsure of the sort of wellness and sort of integrative health route. Like I wasn't super confident in the traditional medical system, but at the same time, it gave me a lot more comfort than, sort of some of these other things. And that was the first time where I remember, I'll never forget, I was in my office and I was sitting on hold with an insurance company. It was like, I had been on the call for like 2.5 hours. And I remember saying to myself, why am I doing this? I'm sitting here fighting with an insurance company for a medication that we're not even sure we want to give her. And it was just absolutely mind-boggling, like, why the system was set up in such a way that made it so difficult to get this, this process through. And I'll give one more example that's not, targeted at the traditional medical system. One of the challenges with integrative health, aside from the costs and cost containment and managing that, which is a very real challenge, and we can talk through some methods to kind of manage that and kind of work through that. But the reality is, most of the times that you're dealing with an integrative health provider, you're essentially working with an individual. You're not working with a large organization, which means all of the sort of systems, the scheduling, the labs, all of this, you have to coordinate yourself. You have to find the labs, you have to find the phlebotomist to draw your blood.
Depending on the lab, yeah.
Oh, no, really? So some of them, like the integrated health provider, will show you the lab, or give you the lab to go to?
I just mean a lot of the functional labs are like ones you can do at home.
Right. That's a good point.
If it's a blood lab, then yes, you'll need to go somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of nuances. That's a good distinction. You're right, because if it's a urinalysis or a stool sample or something like that, you can do that at home.
Mm-hmm.
But if you need to get blood drawn, oftentimes you can't just go to a Quest. You have to find a phlebotomist.
Yeah.
There are independent places that do it, but you have to know where to look.
Yeah.
So I mean, those are just some general examples of like how complex this stuff can get. I'd like to, maybe we can transition a little bit into talking about sort of the organization methods and sort of how we approach some of these challenges.
Yeah, I think and I talked about this before, if not on the podcast, definitely on social media a bit, of how crucial it is to keep logs of things, right? Like we recently stumbled upon one of our logs that we used for our daughter, and it can be so helpful when you're dealing with different teams, different specialists, and honestly just to track progress and where things are at, right? Because sometimes you go see a specialist, maybe it was 3 months ago that you were referred to them and now you finally get to see them. They're asking, well, how's it been going? And if you're like, oh, okay, like that's not very helpful, right? Coming to the conversation with as much data and information as you can is going to help them tremendously. I feel like we saw that when we would come in with a notebook or we had notes, and thankfully we were both able to go to most of her appointments together, if they were virtual or in person, so that we had two people to kind of pull from our memory, but that's not always going to be perfect, right? So documenting everything, I think, is super important. As far as organization, I mean, we had spreadsheets of, as far as expenses, right? Like keeping track of everything, which things were covered, which things weren't. Different hospital networks are sending you different bills. One thing I didn't realize is if you have a hospital stay, even sometimes procedures, right? We've gotten you get two different invoices sometimes, right? Nowadays, a lot of hospitals, the physicians that treat you at the hospital are actually independent contractors. They do not work for the hospital. So you get a bill from the hospital, and then you get a bill from the physician. And sometimes it's confusing. Last year, we had a silly kind of hospital visit where our daughter stuck a cashew up her nose and I couldn't get it out. We were on the way home from school, so we went to the hospital, to the emergency room, and they were able to get it out for us, and we went on our way. We were there less than 15 minutes. I got a bill in the mail for a fee, and it was the physician fee, and so I thought, okay, I paid it, and I moved on. And then I got another bill for a different amount, and I thought, well, why am I getting 2 invoices? I already paid this. It turned out the one bill was just for the physician, the other's for the hospital itself. So you have to be very organized with the mail. You need to make sure that you're getting everything. So medical bills are one.
That raises a good point too of like the mail, and this is gonna sound really silly, but like check your mail. Like it sounds stupid, but like honestly, because it's so easy in today's day and age to just kind of be dismissive of things. And I remember one time we had a bill come in, not a bill come in really. We got a call from collections, and we're normally super on top of this.
Yeah.
And we were like, I don't even know what this bill is, and I don't remember, like we just somehow missed it. And it's like, and it's a silly thing, but when you know that you've gone to the hospital and you're gonna get a bill, like stay on top of that, because the hospital system is like clockwork. Like if that whatever their past due date hits, like it will go to collections, it will hurt your credit. Thankfully I don't think we've ever been in a situation where like it's gotten so bad that it's actually dinged our credit, but it can.
Well, medical bills are different though,
okay,
in a way where I'm not sure that it does affect your credit. I think it's not allowed to actually affect your credit if it's medical. I think
you might be right about that.
And if you do have medical bills that are, large, like, our daughter had some hospital stays that out of pocket, what we paid after our insurance was, thousands of dollars. So you always have the option to call and work with them and set up a payment plan, and they cannot charge you interest.
That's right.
So if you're like, I can only pay $50 a month on this and the bill's $10,000, like they'll usually work with you on that and take that, right? So that's just a tip of, if you get a bill, call them. You've done a lot of research on this too. Like you get a bill from the hospital, say you had a hospital stay. Some of the line items on there are, I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole. It's outrageous, but you do have a right to negotiate, to call, to get more information if you're not satisfied with what the bill is saying.
I believe the rule is, especially with hospital stays, anything that's in your room, whether it's opened or not, gets billed to you. And you can reject certain things. So like some, people that go really into this will and this is more applicable to like pregnancies and hospital stays related to birth. But some people will actually like bring their own pain medication, bring their own, and they'll say, they'll say like, I don't want,
don't bring me this,
don't bring me this, don't bring me that, because it sounds a little crazy or a little over the top, but like things like 2 pills of Tylenol, that's, however, pretty inexpensive, just going to CVS and picking that up, in the hospital could be like a couple $100, right? Like, and maybe that's an extreme example, but like that is, there's an extreme markup on the products that you get inside a hospital room as opposed to things that you buy at a CVS.
Which, if you're going for an emergency, you probably don't have time to plan ahead and pack a bag of stuff. Sure. But to be mindful of what you're being offered, you always have the opportunity to say no, right? I think, and we've come across this. We were in the emergency room at one point, and the resident came in, and he was like, "Yep, we're going to do this," and we both said, No, we're not. And he was very surprised. And I don't know if we've talked about this before, but he was very surprised, and we told him why, and he agreed. He went back. He had already read our daughter's history, but he went through it again. He went and talked to her GI doctor and came up with a plan and worked with us on it of what we were comfortable with. So that's another thing to remember, is you are always in control. If you're in the doctor's office and they are recommending something that you do not feel comfortable with, you are in control of that. So you never have to make a decision that day. They can, if there's a prescription or a medication or a referral or something that they're suggesting that you're unsure of, I've gotten better about this. Nick always says, if they offer a prescription or something, just take it. It doesn't mean you have to fill it. It doesn't mean you have to give it, right? But just be open to what they're saying, and then do your own research and then decide, right? They might say, I want to refer you to XYZ. Okay, let them put in the referral. they'll call you to schedule it. If it's not something you want to do, don't schedule the appointment, right?
Yeah,
like
and that
you're
brings
in
up,
control.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that brings up a really, really important point, which is part of why when a doctor suggests something, you should be receptive. You're well within your rights to push back. But one of the challenges, especially when you're dealing with a child, is that, the hospitals and the doctors, they do have a right to file a negligence claim. And so if they feel like the parent is not doing what's in the child's best interest or or making decisions that are dangerous, protective services can actually be called and be brought in. And so you have to walk a very fine line of when you push back on a doctor, a medical expert in a hospital setting, particularly when you're dealing with a minor, you have to be very cautious about it. And part of why our medical team was so large was that we always had a sounding board or a medical expert that could back us up with when we were saying, hey, this doctor or this specialist is recommending this, and we're not really comfortable with it because it's going to affect this side of this case and cause this complication. And we would always try to have some counterbalance so that if one of those specialists did raise that flag or did try to get protective services involved, we had some documentation and some support as to why we were pushing back on it.
Yeah, and we definitely tried to, even though we would sometimes push back on things that the doctors were recommending, or we would advocate for a different route. Like Nick said, we were always respectful. We were never, it was never a tense conversation, right? Even if we inside were thinking in our head, we don't agree with this or we're not sure about that, it was always a respectful conversation. Like I said, when you come to the table prepared, you have your logs, you have the information, you've done your research, right? You've talked to your insurance company about things that you were, weren't sure if they were going to be covered. Like that's your responsibility to do too, right? The doctors come. It makes their approach different, I think, when they can tell that you're so invested, you've done your research, and even though we weren't saying we were 100% correct, we don't trust you. It's a more collaborative conversation, right? But there is a real, and I've talked to different people that different states have different kind of regulations around some of this, but it's a very true thing when you're dealing with children that that you walk that fine line, right? Of ultimately, if you feel like there's a different route, you need to still work with your medical professional to make sure that they're in agreement with what you're suggesting. So that is definitely an important aspect of it is making sure that you are advocating for your point, but also working with your medical team. And frankly, we had how many different GIs over the few years? At least 5.
At least.
Now it's probably been 6 or 7, right? And that is another process that you have a right to do that, right? I don't know if a lot of people, I've talked to some people like, oh, well, this is what my doctor said, so that's it. It's like you have a right to get a second opinion. Look at if you have insurance, right? See who's covered in your network. If your doctor's telling you shouldn't get a second opinion, that's a red flag. A lot of our doctors, when we said, we're getting a second opinion from this children's hospital, we worked with a research hospital that was well known in this space, and most of our doctors were very open, very open to it, right?
To a degree. I can remember a few situations where we saw a specialist and we talked about getting a second opinion, or we talked about some research doctors that we were working with, and they were not very receptive to it, and those people were very quickly removed from our team.
Right, yeah, that was a huge red flag to us of why are you not open to this? Other doctors within the same practice even had said, get a second opinion, let us know what they say. We have seen, this is a very rare thing that we haven't seen a lot of this in children as young as your daughter. So if there's other hospitals or practices that see it more in bigger cities or research hospitals, please go get a second opinion there.
And another thing, to that point, if your doctor's not, if you have a case that's that's very complex, and and you're not getting to the root cause, and it's going on for months and months or years, and you have a team of specialists that are looking at this, and you're just not gaining traction. If your doctors aren't curious and they're not, right. and they don't seem like they're really trying to dig in and figure out what's going on, That's a red flag. That's a red flag because and a lot. And if you take a step back and you think about how an individual comes into the medical profession, oftentimes it's because they want to help people, right? And the second part of it is because they're scientists, they're researchers, they're right. That's their training. So if that side of them and you have a case that's not sort of by the book, you need people that are curious. You need to have somebody involved in a research hospital on your team to be that voice of, yeah, this is an anomaly and we're studying this type of a regimen or a protocol to treat this illness. Because ultimately, our bodies are complex. I say it all the time, like every body is different and there are standard things that work, but when you get to this place of everyone's kind of scratching their head, then you need that collaborative approach.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. When we moved, we had to find a new GI doctor, and there are resources for doctors that are, receptive to the diet that our daughter is on, GI doctors that also associate themselves with this diet. And there are resources online that I think I've shared before, but I'll share again in these notes of, if you're looking for a provider that supports the specific carbohydrate diet, here's a list of all the ones in certain states. That's how we found our doctor in Florida that we ultimately were working with before we moved, that we loved. And then when we moved to a new state, we looked up the doctors that were on that list, and the only ones that came up were at least 4 hours away from where we live. So we reached out to one, because we felt strongly about it, but we also had some PTSD because when we've worked with doctors that were not supportive of diet, it was traumatic, to be honest. It did not go well. So we reached out to this doctor and he met with us, and the first thing he said was, I'm 4 hours from you. I cannot be your daughter's primary GI. If she ends up in a hospital, I can't be there. Like, you need someone local. Like, why did you reach out to me? And I remember he was pretty kind of like, I don't want to say stern, but very blunt and like to the point in the beginning of the call. And I almost started, I think I did start crying on the phone with him, right? And I just said, we have had some really bad experiences with, doctors that were not open to diet and told us it wouldn't work and were just really opposed to it. So the idea of hiring another just traditional GI that we don't know that will be supportive of the diet was it was too much. Like,
I think you just said something really important though that I want to reiterate. And what you said is, we don't feel comfortable hiring a doctor, and like, you are hiring that person. And it often doesn't feel that way, right? Like, it often feels like this is a service that's available to you. And depending on where you live, you may have more or less options. Mm-hmm. But like, at the end of the day, yes, the insurance pays for it. Yes, there's but it is ultimately your decision. You are hiring somebody for the skills and the services that they provide. And like, you always need to have that in the back of your mind. And if you're not getting, and we've said this on a couple of episodes, if you're not getting the service and you're not getting the results, then you need to move on. And I think it's I forget if it's a book that you read or something that we came across somewhere, but like, there's this saying of like, how many times would you have the same plumber or contractor come into your house to fix the same problem and have the same leak? Maybe twice, maybe 3 times at best, but then after that, you would move on. You'd be like, I'm not letting this person in my house again.
Yeah. Right, the leak is still there, and if this goes on for years and you're just complacent with it, like, well, this is what my doctor said, it's like, well, does that sit well with you? Like, it doesn't sit well with me. And when you think about it that way, I think it's really powerful. Like, in what other profession would you allow someone to not fix the issue for an undefined amount of time and still work with that person, right?
Yeah. Well, I think with the medical system in general, anytime there's a healthcare, I think there's a fear that there's going to be a loss in translation, right? And this circles right back to our overarching point of like, that's why you need to take control. You need to be in control of the documentation. You need to be in control of who has what records, so that when you do transition, whether, and this is a whole other area that we could spend a half an hour talking about alone, but whether there's an issue transferring medical records from one provider to another or not, like, if you're in control of those records, then you can still provide a lot of the same information, not all of it, but like at the end of the day, that's your data. Those are your records. You have rights to those, and if you keep them well organized and you stay on top of it, then you can easily transition. And that's it's a scary thing. I'm not saying that flippantly, like, oh yeah, leave your specialist that you've been with for however long. But at the same time, if you're not gaining results and they're not getting to the bottom of the issue, you have to ask yourself, is there somebody else who's going to look at this in a different way that's going to get you the results that you're seeking?
Yeah, absolutely. But
yeah. So I mean, we've talked about you know a lot of what I think we wanted to cover in this episode, kind of through different means. But I mean, one thing that we want to touch on, I know where this episode in particular has been a little bit focused on traditional medical systems, but also want to focus on integrative health systems and sort of understanding you know, ways to organize that and navigate that. And I think the biggest challenge there is, you know, really being open-minded, but at the same time critical as to what's, you know, what is really has been proved scientifically, what's pseudoscience, and really kind of weeding through some of that. Because there is a fine line, and you're going to find a wide range of practitioners. You know, some practitioners are going to be, you know, are going to come from a hospital background. You know, maybe they're an acupuncturist, maybe they're a, you know, former nurse or a registered dietitian, and they've been around those settings and then have found other ways, and they're going to come at it from a little bit more of a pragmatic approach of you know, this is what the data says and this is what the science says. But you are also going to have providers that are on the other end of the spectrum that, you know, get a certification, and maybe they're, you know, a little bit more on the woo-woo side of it, or and maybe you're open to that, maybe you're not. So, you know, my point being is when you go into integrative health and holistic health, just knowing what those filters are for yourself and what those you know, barometers, and it's going to be different for everybody. But how you gauge that, and, you know, I think, you know, so that's sort of one area. And then also being cautious about, you know, when you do have an appointment with an integrative health specialist and they say, you know, take these supplements and do this, be comfortable with talking to your traditional doctor and your traditional about, hey, like, this is what my integrative health provider is suggesting, because there can be times when supplements can have really bad negative interactions with medications, and everybody needs to be aware of what the full protocol is. Mm-hmm. Otherwise you can really make a situation pretty bad pretty fast.
Mm-hmm. And if you're working with an alternative person, you know, they should be asking you what medications you're on, and doing some, being able to kind of bridge some of that gap for you, but also knowing when to say, hey, make sure you know, run this by your doctor, talk to your MD about this is my suggestion, and then going from there. But I agree with Nick, like, you need to, if it's a conventional medicine, alternative medicine, whatever it is, a witch doctor, like whatever it is that you're working with, you need to find a team that you connect with, that you trust, right? Because if you don't trust them, then the relationship is doomed, right? On the conventional side or on the alternative side, right? So
there's been some, this is sort of different, but it corresponds with it, is that there's been some recent studies that have come out that have found that the way that people are able to sort of manifest things, if you will, is that it's not that you get what you think, but you do get what you believe. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about the placebo effect in other episodes, but that's why this is so crucial, is that if you don't have confidence in your team, and if you don't have confidence in yourself, it's going to be a more of an uphill battle than, and I'm not saying go in with blind faith, but you have to trust your instinct and you have to trust your gut.
Yeah, and mindset just about yourself, right, too, of do you believe that you can heal from whatever you're going through? That makes a big difference. We've talked about that before. So it's not just your mindset of what you believe you're capable of, but yeah, your mindset and what you believe your team is capable of. And if you don't have faith in your team, you may want to get a new team, right? Because if you don't have faith in them, then whatever they suggest, you're going to question it, right? And there is a real scientific, it's been scientifically studied, right, that your belief and your trust in people does have an impact on the outcome, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last thing I want to touch on is something that's, it may be fundamental, but I want to talk through it for those of you who, maybe aren't aware, is when you have a high deductible plan, making sure that you're using your HSA effectively.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain allotment of money that you can put aside that's tax free, and the general rule is if you can fund your HSA enough that you have enough in that account to cover your out of pocket maximum, that's sort of the ideal state.
Mm-hmm.
Because then, and the first year that you do it, it's like kind of a shock to the checkbook because you're like, oh my God, I'm $8,000 or whatever the number is less what I normally have bringing in. But once you get past that first year, and HSA rolls over year, so once you get past that first year, if you have that maximum amount in your HSA, then everything else is kind of gravy on top of that. And then you can start to use those funds tax-free for things like toothpaste, Tylenol, toilet paper, like things that you would buy anyway, but you're able to put those funds away tax-free. So just being mindful about that as well of how these expenses are hitting and tracking can be it's daunting, and we joke all the time. I mean, we had workbooks, we had spreadsheets, we track this at a very granular level, but it's extremely beneficial.
Yeah, for sure. I think maximizing those pre-tax amounts. And I hope that there's more changes to what you can use your HSA funds. Because like Nick said, you can go buy toilet paper or, toothpaste, but you can't right now, use it for things like mental health coaching or even functional labs, right? So like
mental health coaching, you can if a doctor recommends it. So if a doctor provides an actual recommendation, then with mental health coaching, you can use an HSA and FSA. With the labs, it's murky, and this comes back to the phlebotomist episode thing. Like a lot of the labs, you're right, but some phlebotomists you can do. So this is again another area where the more you can kind of do this research and find, like as an example, this is something that I've just learned within the past month. Like a mobile phlebotomist, you can't, but a stationary location, you can use an HSA. Don't know why, but that seems to be kind of how it's structured.
I think it depends if they're associated with a medical doctor too, right?
Yeah, that could be.
So yeah, a lot of the functional stuff too. If it's a medical doctor is recommending it, then you can use your HSA. If you're working with someone like me who is not a medical doctor, you should, technically not be using your HSA funds, right? Some people do, but I don't. That's, a topic for another day.
Right. So yeah, with that, I think we covered pretty much everything. I hope this episode was educational for you and gave you some thoughts and some hopes on whatever it is that you're dealing with. As always, if you're interested in working with either Andrew or I for either on the integrative health side, on the mental health side, or if you just have some questions and are having trouble figuring out how to get your case and your situation a little better organized, we'd be happy to help with that. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.